Okay, people, happy Thursday. Like a 3-day snow day followed by a 4-day weekend, which next week's going to be messed up too because we had to cancel iStep or postpone. I shouldn't say cancel. Postpone iStep. So all next week's going to be messed up, whichever way they do that. So anyway, we're going to soldier on with our notes. I went to school yesterday, got my binder, so now my lecture will make a little more sense, I hope. And so we are ready to begin on the top of page 7. I am going to lecture for quite a bit today because we've got to get stuff going, okay? Um, so we are on page 7 with the second election of Garfield, and this will be the second assassination that we have of a president, Lincoln, obviously first. What's important to note is that these assassinations, and we're going to have another one in a couple of short years. We have 2 during the Gilded Age, both of them about the same reasons, going back on page 6 about our stalwarts and our political machine. Both of these assassinations of Garfield and McKinley are going to be for the same reasons, that this political machine, these men working in that political machine, and that's the idea of the political machine, is working to get your candidate elected. And then when your candidate gets elected, everyone behind him gets some kind of kickback, payoff, job, something. And when that doesn't happen, certain people get upset and agitated. And that will be what happens to Garfield. The other important thing to note is Lincoln, McKinley, Garfield are all assassinated up close and personal by their assassins. There's no detail keeping the president safe or protected from the public at this point, even after Lincoln and even after Garfield and even after McKinley. It takes a while before we feel the need to protect the president in the way that the president's protected now. So Garfield's standing on a platform, on a train, waiting to get the train to go on vacation to meet his wife. The assassin, and I always can't ever pronounce his name because it's Serbian, I think. He comes up and says, I'm a stalwart. I work to get you elected and you don't give me anything. And then pops a cap in his gut. Now, Garfield has a gigantic belly. Like many of our Gilded Age presidents, they live to excess. And it was a very small caliber gun. It did not instantly kill him, probably would not have killed him at all, except for the inept doctors that then took care of him for the next 3 weeks, that moved that little teeny gunshot incision to 20 inches that ran all the way down to his groin, and the probing and the unsterile conditions. And what ends up happening is the defense for the assassin then becomes the assassin didn't kill him, the doctors killed them. And it was a fairly strong case that the doctors did kill him, but obviously the doctors wouldn't have to if he hadn't even shot him. When the doctors submit their bill to the Senate to be paid, there is huge discussion about should we even pay this bill because what the doctors did was awful for him. That's another interesting side point. But anyway, Garfield is assassinated. Now, the only reason we really talk about this assassination in the sense that it is significant is on page 7, letter E, the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act is what will be what begins to make this political machine die. The Pendleton Act says you can't take office based on wealth. There has to be some kind of merit system. In other words, you have to be qualified for the job in which you were given. And that is what is hoped to take away this political machine, that awarding government positions, awarding government jobs now is based on your ability and not your wealth and not your connections. So they set up a civil service commission. And that, again, is a civil service job with the government, and it gives exams to jobs. So for instance, I know the post office gives exams. If you want to work for the post office, you have to take a civil service exams. In our surrounding area, Anybody that has or knows anyone that works at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, they are civil service employees. If you work for the post office, if you have any family members that work at Crane Naval Station, they are probably civil service employees, and they are given a rank, and that is how they are paid, no matter what and who they are. Everybody that has a GS 10 gets paid the same as any other GS 10. If you want to become a GS 11, you have to pass a test in your job field. You have to have a certain number of years in service. So it's very regimented in order to begin to start taking away this political machine that rewards corruption. It's going to take a long time, but at least it's steps that are going into that place. Again, if we look at on page 7, letter E, number 2, the problem, federal patronage from powerful office seekers will be significantly reduced, thus forcing politicians to look to corporations. Please put a box around that corporation. So now they can't go to individuals, they need to go to corporations. And again, that will be where this economic boom will come into play. So, election of 1884, Blaine is the Republican nominee. Everyone is upset with Republicans. They didn't like the way that was done. So, we elect, or the Democrats uh, nominate Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland to me always sounds like a Sesame Street puppet, but Grover Cleveland, seen as a reformer, former governor from New York, honesty, efficiency, and let's look at C, number 2. This begins this long held nativist belief about Catholicism. Any New York Republican clergy, a New York Republican clergy damned the Republican Party as Romanish, and Romanish is the Catholic faith, and rebellion. Insulted the Irish community, and as a result of that, Grover Cleveland is elected. Cleveland is elected. The desertion of the Mugwumps in New York will give Cleveland's victory. He gets the South. He will be the first Democratic president in 28 years. Cleveland's presidency is kind of unremarkable, not a lot of stuff going on. He is a believer in laissez-faire, and make sure you know what that means. Hands off. Laissez-faire, hands off. Um, military pensions. Tariffs, again, are going to become the big issues, like we said a couple of days ago. And not much happening in Grover Cleveland. And again, we're going to end that. And page 9, election of 1888. Democrats grudgingly nominate Cleveland again. And Republicans, Benjamin Harrison. And he is the grandson of William Henry Harrison. And we will then elect Harrison, although Cleveland had more popular votes. I have to change my notes because it says second time in history, most popular votes loses. I got to change that. Cleveland's the first sitting president to be voted out since Van Buren, and Republicans interpret House victories as a mandate for the Senate. So we're done with that politics. And now we're moving on to something a little more interesting, industrialism. And in this aspect, this is what makes the Gilded Age. Industrialization is what changes the United States, which brings the United States onto the world playing power as an economic superpower. And it is a tremendous economic superpower. It is an explosion into the world for the United States. So that chart is the same chart. It's going to show up at the beginning of every set of notes, but down at the bottom is something that you need to make sure that you understand, because we're getting ready to do our second industrialization, right? We already had our first one, and our first industrialization was textile, railroads, iron, and coal. This industrial revolution is going to be same, railroads, but now we're doing oil, steel, and electricity. And that's what changes radically the industrialization of the United States. So on the top of page 2, our major ideas are this. Excuse me. And number one is significantly important. By the turn of the century, by entering into the 20th century, the United States was the most powerful economy in the world. It exceeded the combined outputs of Germany and Great Britain. Great Britain was the initial superpower industrial of the world. Germany, when it became a country, soon outsurpassed that. But now the United States, in really 10 short years, outproduces both of those countries together. And that, again, is really important. As always, my hair. Good grief, hair. Quit it. Okay, so how does that happen? I don't know why I have that there. All right, so let's skip number one. I don't even know why I have that there. Number two, our technology is what gets us there. Steel for railroads, skyscrapers, engines. Oil, mostly used, and please don't think oil yet for cars. We're not yet at the car thing. Oil is used for lighting homes, businesses, that kind of thing. Later, internal combustion engines, cars, that'll be much later. Electric. Electricity, again, is what is the most powerful transforming part of this industrial revolution. Because we have lights, that will change the way working conditions in factories are done. Prior to electricity, work in factories or any place was done from sun up to sundown. You're limited by light. Now that we have electricity, there is no longer a limit to the working conditions. Now, that's going to be a gigantic check plus positive for manufacturers and businesses. It's going to be a check plus negative for workers, right? Because their working day and working conditions are going to change radically with the ability of factories to stay open for longer periods of time. So, electricity, lights, power, refrigerated cars, all kinds of things. 2D, please don't lose 2D either, because this is a hidden part of this industrial technology revolution, the technology that businesses use to expand. And that is going to be really important. It sounds minuscule, but it's really important. The telephone, typewriters, cash registers, adding machines, all of those things are going to radically change the way businessmen can conduct business, which will expand the industrial capability of the United States. And then, as a side of that, we're making more than just business things. Popular culture, cameras, phonographs, bicycles, moving pictures, amusement parks, professional sports. And again, all of this is going to add to the ability of the United States to economically outsurpass every other country and spur this gigantic explosion of wealth. Let me see how long. Oh, I've only been talking 10 minutes. Okay. Sorry about the close up again. So, in the 1880s, 50% of Americans worked in agriculture. By the 1920s, which is where we're headed after this, 25%. That's a radical change. It tells us two things. One that's really important is that agriculture got really, really self sufficient and that it didn't need as many people to produce as much or if more. And the second part is there's a lot of jobs for people that don't involve agriculture, and that's important as well. Many of the 50% in agriculture, not because they enjoy farming, but because that was only one of the few ways that they knew how to earn a living. So that's significant as well. Class divisions will become more pronounced and it will be gigantic. These class divisions that will develop as a result of this will be significant, huge, and very long lasting. So, look at 6. Remember again, we always talk about these depressions and panics. They're always the same thing. Now we're going to change what we're over speculating, but look how many there are. And that, my APUSH friend, is why you don't need to know specific things about them because there are so many. You need to know generalities. And on 6, you just take a look at how many there are. There are so many. And it is as a result of all of this speculation in the Industrial Revolution. So, railroad, we're going to build tons of railroads. So many railroads. And I got to check this. Okay. So many railroads. One of the important things, again, at this point is how the government is working with these private individuals to build these railroads. And we'll talk about that in a second. Cities are going to grow up around these tracks. We've already talked about the Transcontinental Railroad. At the bottom of the page, the Pacific Railway Act, that was passed, remember, during the Civil War. And so there was not a discussion about would the Transcontinental Railroad head north or south. It just went north because there was no one to object to where it went. So it starts if we turn the page, it starts in Omaha, Nebraska. The Union Pacific Railroad built west from Omaha, Nebraska, about 20 miles a day. Now, the significant part of this as we move forward is who built what side, because we're getting ready. I think our third section of the Gilded Age is going to be about immigration. And the Union Pacific that starts in Omaha, Nebraska, was built mainly by Irish. So those Irish immigrants that had been pouring into New York and Boston will head out into the west to build this railroad. The Central Pacific Railroad starts in Sacramento, California, and they have the big task of building over the Sierra Nevada mountains, and they are fairly significant mountains. As a result of that, they needed to find experts in dealing with gunpowder and dealing with explosives, and that happened to be the Chinese. And so the Chinese were invited over by the Pacific Railroad to help with this exploding of dynamite and boring into these mountains with their expertise. So the Central Pacific is going to be built mostly by Chinese. Now, again, this is going to be led by the Big Four. We don't need to know all four of them, but we need to know this guy named Stanford. Again, he's going to build this big university out in California. The 3D, 10,000 Chinese laborers with, again, as I note up on page 3, 2D patties. That was a derogatory term used to designate Irish patties. And on 3D, coolies, the same for the Chinese. What's going to happen that we're going to get in our next section is when the railroad's built, most of these Chinese don't go home. And that will begin some of our immigration issues that we'll be dealing with in our next chapter. So they start building, one from one end, Sacramento, the other from Omaha, and start building, and they will meet at 4 Promontory Port, Utah, May 10th, 1869. And it's again an engineering a feat that is still hard to believe that was done without the aid of any kind of communication devices, no computers, no telephones yet. How you build something like this and it ends up at the right point at the right time. It's still amazing to me. So Promontory Point, they meet up, and now we have a transcontinental railroad, which means people can move from coast to coast in about a week, which is fairly significant. It also means you can move goods. And that again will be a significant part of both the advancement of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. It also is going to be a detriment to everything in the middle of our country that we had kind of just glossed over when we moved out west in 1849. And that, again, will bring a drastic change to our country. So that's that. At the top of page 4, we've got all other kinds of railroads being built. You can look at, in particular, all those. But on page 4, we have a man and a name that we need to know. Cornelius Vanderbilt. You need to draw a giant box around Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt is the guy that builds the railroads, and he will be the beginnings of this gigantic explosion of wealth that is unsurpassed in any other time in our history. And I mentioned this a couple of times. When we account for inflation and do all the things to make money equal money, the top wealth getters, the top wealthy people of our country are still these people. Vanderbilt Rockefeller, Morgan. Outsurpasses Gates, Buffett, anybody you can name by a lot. I don't even think Bill Gates is in the top 5 when we adjust for all that. Vanderbilt certainly is. So you need to always make sure that you have Vanderbilt with the railroads. Popularized the steel rail, amassed a fortune of $100 million in 1877. That is a tremendous amount of money. It is so much money um, that it's impossible to even fathom. So he's our first real Gilded Age multi-millionaire. The significance of the railroad, and this again is big. Historians really give two things, two inventions that categorically changed the United States forever and put it on its path. And those two things they argue back and forth, the railroad and the automobile. I'm going to stick with the railroad because it was first and it does more than really anything with the automobile. Because without the train first, I don't know that the automobile would have had the ability to do what it does. So, the significance of the American Railroad, it is enormous. It is the most important development in the history of our country as far as making it what it is today. So, spurred industrialization, that everything about the railroad and everything the railroad does is what is created in that industrial revolution. The nation becomes connected physically, and that is still an important part, that we become a connected nation through this railroad, that people can move about, goods can move about, ideas can move about, and that's important as well. Created huge domestic market for US raw materials. Now people can move these goods at a quicker pace. People have access to things that they would have never been able to have access to before. Stimulated the 3 western frontiers. Please look at 4 and make sure you note that. Mining, agriculture, and ranching. Led to exodus to cities from rural areas. People are going to move very easily out of rural areas into large cities. And again, most important, influx of immigrants as a result of that. On the top of page 5, spurred investment from abroad. Number 8 is really important, and you know how Mrs. Norris feels about these time zones. We have to create time zones. Prior to the railroad, no time zones. No reason to have correct time. In 1870, if you traveled from Terre Haute, if we could simultaneously put someone in Terre Haute, someone in Sullivan, someone in Graysville, someone in Carlisle, and say, what time is it? None of them would have the same time. None of them. There was no reason to coordinate time. There was no reason. Railroads are going to make the reason to coordinate time because, as any of you know that live on this side of the track, trains travel both ways on a track. And it's imperative to know to the exact moment when trains are moving back and forth. And so until the development of the railroad, we don't have time zones. We have no sense of needing specific times until the railroads. And so this will be one of the things that the United States begins its step out onto the world stage because it's the United States that says, hey, we need to make these time zones. And they'll have this big conference and divide the world up into time zones, in which Indiana is in the central time zone, not the Eastern time zone, which is why we're always weird when we do and change our times in the daylight saving time because we should be central time. There's my little TED talk. Okay. Makers of millionaires, please look at number 10 because as always, what the College Board wants us to be able to do, positives and negatives. And one gigantic negative is number 10. There were people living in the places where we were building these railroads and they're displaced. And they're displaced violently. They're displaced with action from the United States military. And that will again be a destruction of the Native Americans. And we'll get that in our chapter, I think it's called The West. So, corruption. Cannot do this without a lot of corruption. And this is how a lot of these people will be. Sorry again for the close up. I can't see the time. So, Corruption by robber barons. So this is again a word that you need to know what that means. You need to be able to know that that deals with the Gilded Age. You also need to know where it comes from. So obviously, in our Constitution, we do not have titles of nobility. The United States is not able. The United States does not. Give titles of nobility. You're not allowed to take a title of nobility. So as a result of that, we come up with this robber barons. And a baron is a title of nobility. And again, it's in quotation marks. It's one of the highest titles of nobility, like right up there next to a king. And then we have the word robber. And so what this robber barons um, means and what they are called in the Gilded Age is that the reason they've reached and attained this high level of wealth, prestige, influence is at the expense of their workers. And we'll get to that later on as we go. Um, and there's a big debate of these men, robber barons or captains of industry. And for the most part, you should be able to argue on both sides that yes, they were robber barons, that the conditions that the people that they worked for, that worked for them were horrific. They manipulated the system. They used corruption to gain that wealth, no doubt. But also, we have to be able to argue that they were captains of industry in that the industries that they built spawned other industries and new technologies and new developments in places that benefited society as well. So you should be able to argue on both sides of that. Right now, we're looking at them as robber barons on page 5. Um, One of the things that they did was they would inflate stock. And I think this is such an easy time to understand this. Again, going back to my GameStop Reddit people, inflating stock. It's an easy thing to do, especially when you have money. You buy a whole lot of it, it causes the price to go up. As the price is going up, you start to pull your money out so you get it, and then everybody else takes the crash. Well, that's what they did. They did it expertly as people who understood and could manipulate the stock market. Look at E3. Railroad tycoons, for a time, became the most powerful people in America. More powerful than the president, more powerful than Congress, more powerful than even law enforcement and judges. They, again, ran America. They bribed judges. When you have $100 million, you could do a lot of stuff. Elected their own men into office, eventually ruled as an oligarchy. They formed pools so that they could keep people out of their uh, competition. Some gave secret rebates or kickbacks to large corporations, slashed rates on competing lines, but made up the difference on others. Hurt farmers. They are going to severely hurt farmers in this. Cornelius Vanderbilt, law, what do I care about the law? I got the power, he says. Economically squashed opponents rather than sue them legally. So, how do they do that? And we'll look at some of the ways that they did that on the next page. Government regulation of robber barons, they are slow to react. And because they're slow to react, by the time they do react, there's nothing else that they can really do. Adam Smith, again, discouraged government intervention of the government into the economy. So on the top of page 5, I'm sorry, on top of page 6, this will be our last little discussion of Supreme Court decisions. The Supreme Court decisions are really always going to be help business. And that, again, is part of that. The Depression in the 1870s spurred farmers to complain against being forced into bankruptcy by unfair labor practices. And what those unfair labor practices were is that railroads would charge them whatever they wanted. Farmers were at the mercy of the railroads to bring their grain, their crops, their cattle, anything to the market. And railroads do that. And so they charge them, and they charged them whatever they wanted. There wasn't set fees or set prices. And so the slaughterhouse cases in 1873 molded the court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment. The court ruled that the protection of labor was not a federal responsibility, but a state responsibility, which brought that back to the states. The significance of those slaughter cases was it protected business from federal regulation. And that's what happens. It moved to the states. And when it moved to the states, that set in motion that states could charge or do or be manipulated by these robber barons. So, Munn versus Illinois. Public has a right to regulate business operations in which the public has an interest. Now, that one, again, will side on the case of the public, but it takes too long. And then the Wabash case in 1886, Supreme Court ruled that individual states had no power to regulate interstate commerce. That's a constitutional power given to the federal government. So it nullified the one positive court case that came out, Munn versus Illinois. And so again, we are working towards some kind of way to control the power of these railroad companies. So they're going to pass the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887. First large scale legislation passed by the federal government to regulate corporations in the interest of society. And that's what they're saying. In the interest of society, we must regulate this railroad. So the ICC, again, to enforce and administer the act, prohibited rebates, pools, required railroads to publish their rates, forbid unfair discrimination. Positive result, provide an orderly forum where competing business interests could resolve. But let's turn the page. ICC did not effectively regulate railroads at all. More of a panacea to the public, meaning it just gives the public something that they can hold on to because, in quotation marks, it had no teeth. It had no regulation power. It couldn't do anything if companies failed to follow it. There's nothing they could do. They couldn't enforce fines. There's nothing. And even if they did fines, I have $100 million. What kind of fine are you going to give me? And so, in essence, it doesn't do anything. All right, so we're going to stop there on page 7, and we'll pick this up Tuesday back in class. Again, crazy time this week. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy your 4-day weekend. And I'll see you back in class on Tuesday. Let me know if you have any questions. Oh, and I forgot to say to all my yellow sheet people, this is, I guess, maybe one time procrastination paid off for you because yellow sheets, I'm not going to do all the pictures. It drives me nuts. Yellow sheets are going to be due first thing. And this is what I'm going to say. You need to put them in my hand when you walk in class on Tuesday. So I need them by 8:30 or it will be late. Okay? All right. Have a great weekend. Bye, guys.